Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, people always ask me, when do I consider the spring starts, whether it's Groundhog Day or the first day of spring training, but no, it's today, Budget Introduction Day for fiscal 24. So I'm going to walk through a presentation, and if you have questions, we'd be happy to take them at the end. And also, we will be here on Tuesday evening to look at advertising a number of taxes and fees. So if we could go to the slides. Okay. So let's start off with an overview of the proposed 2024 budget. So our tax revenues, as we estimate them for fiscal 24, are continuing to improve. We'll have details on that in the next few slides. We continue to face expense pressures. Many of them are remaining pressures from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Other are pressures related to inflation and the facts that we are living in a very competitive environment when it comes to workforce. We also continue with priority investments in schools, our housing, mental health, as I mentioned, employees, capital infrastructure, and a number of other areas I will detail. And also I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about some of the pressures we think we're going to be facing, not just this fiscal year, but in the next few years ahead. Our overall budget, by the numbers, is $1.54 billion. That is a 2.8% increase over the fiscal 23 adopted level, and that's including both the ongoing and one-time components of the budget. And you can see the two main components of that are the county operating budget, which is at $933 million, a 2.1% increase, and the schools transfer, which is coming close to $608 million. That's a slightly higher increase of 4%, and that owes to the fact it's based on a revenue sharing agreement and based on tax revenues, not all revenues, and tax revenues are doing better than overall revenues. We'll talk about that in a minute too. When we were with you in December, we were giving you an update where we estimated the gap to be, at that time, between our estimated revenues and expenses for fiscal 24 to be about $35 million. Given that, the board, you directed me to take a look at a series of factors, including service and program efficiencies, the appropriate use of one-time funding, how to make sure that we will fund what we're doing for the first time in 50 years, which are collective bargaining agreements, provide funding options for eviction prevention, housing grants, and the associated costs for our housing with the Affordable Housing Investment Fund, and also to maintain our commitment to schools. There were a number of other items you asked for updates on, which included a stormwater utility fee proposal. We had the pleasure of having a work session with you all on January 31st. The proposed budget will have a discussion of that. Also, you asked me at the time whether I thought I would need additional resources for collective bargaining. The 5 staff that you provided in fiscal 23 right now proved to be enough. I'm not asking for additional resources there. You asked for an update on what kind of investments we need in mental health services, environmental priorities, and then, as you can see on the right column, an update on where we were with implementing the police practices group, our equity resolution, how we were doing on maintaining sustainability of our emergency rental relief programs, and then apropos of the conversation we had earlier today with commercial resiliency, the number of changes we're making in our zoning ordinance to try to bring more options to people for use of our commercial office space. So that $35 million gap back in December, as you know, every time I come to you, I propose a balanced budget where revenues equal expenses. And the facts have changed since November and December. We've seen higher than anticipated real estate assessment growth. I think that a number of people saw that when they received their residential real estate assessments in January. On the commercial side, we had anticipated a drop in overall assessments. And there was a very small drop in the commercial assessments, but when you factor in new commercial building, the numbers were actually up. And then also our other taxes, as I'll talk about in a subsequent slide, are doing quite well. On the expense side, I'm proposing reductions of about $5.5 million. And then thanks to the action of the county board 4 years ago and the work with our partner with Amazon and the opening of the Maplewood solar facility, which is down near Danville, Virginia, we're now realizing every year, starting now going forward, savings. They'll vary depending on what the market is looking like, but this year, $2.6 million savings in our electricity budget. We're also benefiting from lower debt service, which is one of the things that factored into that is we did not go into the debt market in the last 12 months. And then unfortunately, and just an artifact of the labor market, we are still having challenges in hiring vacancies. So we're taking that into account in our expense estimates. And then also, as the board directed, taking a look at how we use one-time funding to fill some of our ongoing costs. And you'll see in the materials that I'm going to provide today, which I'll talk a little bit how people can get access to them, we're leaving unallocated about $4.5 million in one-time funding for the board to use as you go through the process. And just a reminder, we'll be back to you at probably towards the end of the March with our mid-year and third quarter evaluation. And at that time, we'll also update whether there'll be additional funds available. So we go to the next slide. A little bit of a overall focus on where we're doing on revenue. So the budget I'm proposing today, consistent with the guidance I received from the board in December, keeps the real estate tax rate at the same level from last year. So that's $1 and 1.3 cents per $100 of valuation. And then also for stormwater tax rate, 1.7 cents. And this again will be the last year where we're going to be doing that. We're going to be moving to a fee for service arrangement when it comes to stormwater, not for service, fee for impervious surface. Then the average residential property increase that the mythical average homeowner in Arlington County will be seeing is a $369 increase. And the average overall residential bill, which includes all taxes and fees, will be up $454. Now, one thing I did want to take a moment and highlight, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a subsequent slide, is that included in that calculation is people will see on average a household solid waste rate going up about $100. We'll talk about the reasons for that in a minute. On the tax revenue side, as I mentioned, tax revenue growth was higher than what we had anticipated. That included not only real estate assessment, but our business, professional, and occupational license taxes. Personal property tax, if you remember last year, we saw a huge surge in values of cars. This year, values have come back to earth. They're still up 7%. And my proposal assumes 100% valuation of cars, unlike last year where the board adopted an 88% ratio. Sales and meals are up double digits, and hotel taxes are up a third. That will bring us off a lower base, since we're still dealing with the COVID impacts, very close to where we were pre-pandemic. Non-tax revenue, you can see, is down 3%. Obviously, the federal revenue is down a huge amount, given that we're now no longer getting that assistance we received during COVID. State revenue up is a slight amount. I encourage those listening in Richmond, because I know they're tuned in today, to have that number go up further. And then also our fees and charges for service. Most of our fees are going to be going up around 5% to keep pace with inflation. So let's move on to the next slide. This is a summary, and there are about 950 pages of material that will be going online as we speak, that we have about $5.5 million in reductions. Some of those reductions are, for example, items that the board added that we have not yet, in the fiscal 23 budget, we have not yet filled, so we're going to hold off on that. So that would be some functions in my office and also in the county board office. But we are taking capacity out of the system. You can see they're ranked by dollar amount, but in the manager's office, I'll be eliminating a communications manager and a specialist that was going to work on environmental issues. We have some other, I'll call them more technical changes, and we'll be walking through those as we have what are going to be 8 budget work sessions with the county board, where you will go into great detail on each of those items with each of our department heads. Going to the next slide. Over the last couple of years, we have been using one-time funds as a bridge to get us through, given the challenges with ongoing revenue. The board provided direction to me to continue using one-time funding, but to reduce the reliance on that, since that is not the best practice. So you can see in fiscal 22, we were at 16 million last year, 12 million this year. We've reduced that level to $6.5 million. And as we walk through each of those departmental budgets, we'll show you where it was that we relied on the one-time funding. So a little bit of a focus on the main areas, I think, where you're going to probably want to focus time and energy. One is on our workforce. The second is on housing. Third is what we're doing in the area of capital investments. And the fourth is schools. So we'll break that down for you on each of the subsequent slides. On workforce, the county board in December already passed good faith resolutions related to collective bargaining for our uniform fire service at 4.5%, and that's reflected in the proposed budget, our uniform police at 10%, and our service labor and trade workers at 4.5%. I'm also proposing the 4.5% raise for most of the other employees who are not covered by collective bargaining. And I'm also proposing an 8.5% increase for the sheriff. The sheriff, much like the police department, is facing a number of unfilled positions, using those funds from those unfilled positions to try to enhance the salary so our sheriff can try to do his best to fill those vacancies. In addition, as you'll see in the first bullet, for almost all staff, a $2,000 one-time dollar bonus, and something which may not mean a lot to people out there, but will be very meaningful to our employees, related range movements, which means that these salary increases are happening, but the lowest number in the salary range and the highest number will be moving a like amount. So that is, those people who are at the lowest end of the scale will getting these increases, and those people, for a number of them who are, quote, maxed out, the ceiling will move, so they'll also benefit from these pay raises. The additional employee benefits you see on the right include an expansion of parental leave, adoption assistance, our dependent care match, our contribution for health savings care, introduction of something that we had a long time ago, paid bereavement leave, an increase of our DROP program, which allows people who want to transition out of the workforce a 4-year period rather than a 3-year period. We'll be bringing the proposed changes to code for you on that next month for consideration for adoption on July 1st. And then we also, as we do every year, and the board is very focused on this, we have been continue to funding job studies in areas so that we make sure we're staying at market. So people in those categories will also enjoy additional raises above the amounts you see on the left side. That is the summary on workforce investment. Housing. Housing is, you know, we have a lot of conversations about housing. Our fiscal 24 budget is talking about stabilizing households in Arlington and improving housing conditions. And actually, if you take a look at the bar graph here, you can see that there's been a really significant change in the kind of efforts we've been making over the last 5 years when it comes to assisting people for housing. You can see that yellow bar, which is eviction prevention. Back in fiscal 19, we actually didn't do any eviction prevention, and you can see the incredible increase in the number of households where we've been assisting with eviction prevention. And then in addition, you can see the CAF unit inspections, which focus on making sure we're paying attention to our legacy housing stock. We saw that in vivid display with the Serrano conversation the board had over the last 2 years, but the number of inspections we've done of our committed affordable units. And then you can also see the amount of investment in our housing grants. So Those focus on the numbers and the types of things we've been doing. You know, the number of committed affordable units the board has approved, especially focusing on Barcroft from last year. We've had record numbers over the last few years, but those really driving some of the metrics you see in the bar graph. As far as when it comes to dollars, our housing grants will be up from where they were a year before. They're going to be at $14.5 million. Eviction prevention, again, is a bigger number than we're used to seeing. Permanent supportive housing is up, housing choice vouchers up, and then inspections. I did want to take a minute or two to focus on the Columbia Pike tax increment financing, which has been in place, I think, for about 13 years. It was set up to try to promote the introduction and enhancement of affordable housing along Columbia Pike. We're going to keep the TIF in place. Right now, there are balances of close to $4 million in that fund. My proposal is that the board consider using that amount of money to pay down that $150 million contribution we're making towards the Barcroft transaction, working with Jair Lynch, and then also use the ongoing level of funding in the TIF to meet debt service for Barcroft. As a reminder, the debt service associated with Barcroft is close to $5 million per year, and we have seen a skyrocketing of interest rates and cost pressures on that deal. So we had painted out a worst case scenario for you that the debt service would be about $5 million. Unfortunately, we've realized that. We will be to you later this year with a plan on how to permanently finance that project, but with the $1.5 million from the Columbia Pike TIF, the balance of that debt service will have to come from that fixed amount of about $9.5 million in the Affordable Housing Investment Fund. But again, I know we will have long conversations over housing, but I wanted to spend a little time on that. Let's move on to capital investments. We have 7 buckets that we're focused on: technology, parks, transportation, our energy management, what's going on in neighborhoods, and our facilities and public safety. There are a lot of items here. I'm not going to read this to you, but I'm happy to say that our pay-go budget does meet, in every instance where it still made sense, the commitments that the board put on record in adoption of the CIP a year ago. We're not always able to do that. The CIP and sometimes is more of a notional document, but we're meeting all those commitments except in those places where it turns out that our assets are lasting longer or our priorities have changed. So a number of significant investments here in our parks and transportation and technology, and we'll talk a little bit about those as we have the work session, but happy that we're able to at least meet those commitments. Schools. You know, I talked a little bit about upfront the principles of revenue sharing. What we do is we measure what the percentage is of the overall revenue that was in the adopted budget for 23, and that comes up to 46.8%. We then apply that to tax revenues for fiscal 24 to come up with the number that we have here. You can see the ongoing and one-time revenue. And in addition, I always like to talk about this. It gets lost a little bit in the conversation. We are giving more than $10 million in services to the schools on the county side of the ledger. And you can see a number of those things, whether it's in transportation services, you know, landscaping services, our nurses. And that, just to put this in perspective, you know, the enrollment for schools, and you can see it's sort of a little small there in that picture, is estimated, the September numbers, at 26,911. Those numbers are pretty much akin to where we were in fiscal 2018. So, you know, there was a surge in enrollment. Enrollment has dropped off due to COVID, but those numbers are pretty much where they were about 5 years ago. So we'll have more conversations about that as we go on. Some other program updates: stormwater. I won't belabor it for the members of the board here since we were talking about it 2 weeks ago, but we're going to be beginning our transition to a utility fee base that charges people based on impervious surface. Collective bargaining, as I said, I'm not asking for additional resources. On the environment, I'm really happy to say we're going to be accelerating our investments in our electric vehicle fleet. We're going to be doubling the number of public-facing EV charging stations, adding 22 electric vehicles to our fleet, and working on the electrification of our facilities. And happy to say that 3700 South 4 Mile Run, with the investments we're making, will be a fully electrified facility. We are going to be back to you with some details about how we're going to be spending the Climate Action Fund that the board set aside $1 million for this year. And I don't know if you've heard, but we only talked about it 5 times earlier today. We're coming back with an update for our green building incentive policy, which will be important. And also, let's not forget the trees. We're adding funding in for tree planting and tree maintenance. Other program updates, as we go through the budget, we'll talk about where we are with equity. We'll talk a little bit, as we talked about earlier today, about commercial resiliency. And then there's a lot of conversation, I just touched on it, but whether we are on our housing grants and whether that's a sustainable course that we're under. We've had lots of conversations with our affordable housing partners, and I know the board's been actively involved. So an extended conversation there to see what the path forward will be on those efforts as we continue. There's a work group that's about to finish up with some recommendations in that area. Next slide. So I have taken the opportunity in conversations with our library director this year, so everybody listens very carefully. We are not making any proposed changes in our library funding. We actually will have, we've recovered from the pandemic. We are actually opening up, we just opened up, I think it was Saturday service at the Westover Library, if I have that correct. And we're also going to be opening a new library in the lobby of this building right here. And in about 1.5 years, we hope to be opening up a new library down in Crystal City as part of a community benefit there. And as the board has, about 1.5 years ago, we purchased a piece of property on Columbia Pike for the future location of the Columbia Pike Library. Given that, and then the changes that the board made in last year's budget where you approved new staffing, permanent staffing, we have changed the model of the staffing for our libraries from a temp staff basis to a permanent staff. We moved away from reliance on temp staff. That reliance proved to be impractical and really unfair to those temporary staff. Now we're trying to move to a fully permanent staff library. And also we continue to have challenges with materials. And staffing of materials. We've also moved to no library fines. And I think the time has come to think about where we think our library system will be 10 years from now. And that conversation, I think, will be very helpful, again, not with allocation of dollars necessarily, but as we consider what's going to happen with the Columbia Pike site. I welcome the opportunity to have a conversation with the board. We start now. Won't be decided in the budget deliberations, but over the next 12 to 18 months about what our library should look like 10 years from now. And that also would include Central Library, which I know there's been a conversation about what should happen to Quincy Park in that area. So with that, I wanted to also move on to some of the challenges, which I know you are well aware of, that we're facing. We see them this year, but they're going to grow as we continue over the next few years. Just a really profound challenge with what's going on with Metro and ridership there. Right now, our current estimate, and we've written this up in the budget, is that for fiscal 25, Metro is projecting a $527 million gap when it comes to operating expenses. And that gap is estimated to grow to $730 million in fiscal 29. Those are huge numbers. Anytime you hear a number about Metro, Arlington's share of that is somewhere around 8%. And even for us, those would be considerable costs. So I want to make sure we'll be talking about that. And I don't have any answers, but it's important to continue to focus on that. And I think that's enough on that. And you're familiar with where we are in housing and the challenges with our workforce, maintaining a workforce in this tight labor market, and then what we're seeing with inflation and then infrastructure. So let's go on to the next slide. We have for Tuesday, and all the board reports have been posted online. A tax and fee advertisements coming. I have, based on what you've said, I've prepared a budget at those tax rates that's up to the board to determine what you're going to do on Tuesday for a tax rate. Also for a stormwater rate, I'm proposing no change to the personal property tax and B-poll rates, and also the bid tax rates remain flat. I did say I would talk, and I want to take a minute to talk about our household solid waste rate. In fiscal 23, our household solid waste rate was $307.89. Our household solid waste rate in fiscal 17 was $307.28. It's gone up, it's gone down, but it's been essentially flat for 6 years, which has been a factor of a fantastic contract we entered into. 2 contracts, actually, one with our hauler and the other with our recyclable facility that we use. Time's up. Contract is reached a point where we're now in the option year, and our contractor faces labor shortages, labor challenges, fixed costs that have gone up. And I know a $100 increase not only seems, but it actually is a huge amount, but this is what we're seeing in the market. And so make sure that we highlighted that. Some of the other fees, we'll see increases that keep pace with inflation, and we'll be talking about that when we get to specific work sessions. So again, I had mentioned earlier what a typical homeowner in Arlington would face. If you go to the next slide, you'll see this chart we like to use. If you get the next to last column, talks about a $454 difference. The biggest changes being in the real estate tax burden and also the refuse fee. And you can see for personal property, the average burden is actually coming down $41, which is good. And we can highlight that, and we'll have more conversations about that. So the budget calendar, starting today, continuing on Tuesday. Again, all the board reports associated with that, the items for Tuesday have been posted. We have 8 separate work sessions with the county board and 2 public hearings that'll be happening at the end of March. And I have a packet of material for all of you. We have a set of summary materials that are now posted online. If you go into the search bar and type in fiscal year 2024 budget, you will pull up a series of summary materials. That concludes my presentation. I just did want to wrap up. I'm going to say this many times. You're looking at, you have, Michelle is here, and then you have Maria, Richard, and Emily. It's almost like this is the first time they've seen sunlight in a few months, so they'll be blinking a lot, but they're here to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. And before we get into questions, just to remind everybody about our process. So on Tuesday evening, we will convene to hold a public hearing and consider many requests to authorize advertisements of public hearings in March at the budget hearing on the operating budget and other budget-related code amendments, and then separately a tax rate, including real estate and personal property tax rate and other associated fee amendments. So we will invite the public to come on Tuesday to provide any comment on these requests to authorize, and then to look forward to those 2 upcoming public hearings in March, where we will consider comments on the overall budget and tax rates that we advertise, which is what the board will be accomplishing on Tuesday. There are no actions before us today other than having any kind of discussion and Q&A with our expert budget staff. Mr. DeFerranti, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mindful of brevity, I guess the one area that perhaps over the coming week or perhaps Tuesday, if you could offer thoughts, because I think it's going to be a theme throughout, staffing with respect to mental health, because that impacts the vacancies, the vacancy filling rate, which could have a slight impact on our ongoing and one-time funding. It's also such a huge priority. So I just wanted to mention that, to flag it for Tuesday for you. And open any comments, but did want to seek to be brief and just highlight the one that was there from the manager. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, and I know we've had a lot of conversations about that, especially given the conversations the community's been having recently about what's going on with Arlington Public Schools, and more broadly, what we've been seeing in the community. You know, we're very excited that, you know, I signed this letter of intent with Virginia Hospital Center for additional behavioral healthcare beds. Those are 2 years away. We have a real need for additional services there. And in several places in the Department of Human Services, we're experiencing vacancy rates of 30% or sometimes a little bit more. And those are real challenges. And I wrote in the budget message that I'm not actually proposing additional positions in that area, not because I didn't want to, but we have to fill those vacancies first. And it is a real challenge. You know, the board may want to look at some of that one-time money I left unallocated, or you may want to look at additional investments, but, you know, I think that is really the challenge we face as a community right now.
Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank you. We all understand it's a yeoman's work. The 900-plus pages are, I guess, coming in printed form, right? Thank you in advance for that. And actually, I have to say, this is a very nicely presented, even if 900 pages doesn't represent the readability of the document. It's actually way more readable and nicely presented. I have to commend you for that. Year after year, it was extremely helpful for me to start to understand the budget. One part of our of the public testimony that we got last year that came more than often was the status of tax relief for those who cannot afford their property taxes. So what part of the budget does this represent, and where is it?
I will start off, and I'm going to ask if Richard or Emily might want to add. The real estate tax relief program remains in place, and I think we can have some estimates about what that impact is on revenue. But you know, I would encourage people. We sent a lot of information out on this when people got their real estate assessments in January. There's a couple of things people can do. One is get in contact with the treasurer and talk about the program they have for getting loan assistance there. And the other is you obviously have the opportunity to ask questions about your real estate assessment. I don't know, Richard, if you wanted to add anything on that.
Yes, and DHS manages that program. So we'd be happy to provide the board some more detail on that program, and then, if appropriate, have a small discussion at the DHS work session.
Yeah, thank you. I was just asking because we got some testimony. I mean, last year, you know, that was relevant to that program. I know that we will have a work session on that. Thank you.
And just to be clear, we treat that program, and fresh me if my memory is off, but we treat that program more as an entitlement. So we have a budgeted amount based on what we expect, but we fill the need of whoever we qualify. Right. Ms. Crystal.
One thought, this may not be feasible for this year, and so it may be for something going forward, but since we've got the right crackerjack team here, you know, Mr. Manager, you were talking, I think we always sort of do with a bit of a wink to the idea of the fictitious average Arlington household. But it also occurs to me that the majority of Arlington households actually don't look like that fictitious average Arlington household. And so I would be interested to see if we could, you know, maybe drawing on some of the very rich data that we have from our demographic analyses about things like car ownership, probably some pretty fair assumptions that property taxes, commercial property taxes are passed straight on to renters, more or less, to see if we couldn't either this year or in the future try to get a sense of what the changing tax and fee burden looks like for our average multifamily dweller or our average renter, to try to get a sense of this picture. I mean, I think obviously there are a few things that are different, right? We know that those living in certainly rentals, and I think most ownership multifamily buildings too, you know, probably have separate solid waste contracts, for example. Sometimes their utilities are separate. I'm sure, don't have a beat on all of that. But I think it would be really interesting to know, right, how things are changing in terms of what our residents are observing or paying. This also will be meaningful as we switch from the stormwater rate based on real estate to amount of impervious surface. So perhaps a challenge for next year. That may not be feasible this one, but I think it could be a really useful piece of information for the board as we try to think about the balance of the impact of the taxes and fees, and then the impacts of services and service reductions to the whole of our community, and not just the minority that we've always sort of used as typical. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the focus on mental health and your suggestion, Mr. Manager, that perhaps we look at the one-time funds. There are a whole lot of ways to do that. I mean, I'm assuming when we get to that we'll maybe have some recommendations on how we might, there's signing bonuses, there are all kinds of things you can do. I sometimes find maybe this is one area we ought to be providing paid sabbaticals where people get a break, and that there's some things like that we could do. So I'm hoping a little maybe out-of-the-box thinking, and I think we would be open to suggestions, because clearly what we've been doing isn't working. So, thank you.
And I did want to note, because I think this is important to emphasize for people in the community. It was a while ago when this board authorized funding for this Crisis Intervention Center at the Department of Human Services. We've been working literally day and night to staff that up. We're very close to opening it. But we just find, and I was at a meeting with my colleagues in the region about a week ago, we're not alone in this. And so there's a little bit of in the region where we try to outpace each other when it comes to pay with bonuses and those kinds of things. But this is a regional and a national issue. And yeah, I think that, looking at ways to, what's the word I'm looking for? To take care of our workers who are doing this kind of work, which really wears them down, is also an important element of that, like you mentioned.
Yeah, no, exactly. And maybe partnering with, Marymount or Georgetown or or George Mason to start building, providing programs, internships, things to get folks into the field too. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right, hearing none, thank you, Mr. Schwartz, for the presentation. We look forward to spending so much more quality time with Ms. Meredith, Ms. Hughes, and Mr. Stevenson over the course of the next few months. And board will be hard at work over the next 72 hours, really thinking about what's going to influence the determinations to adopt, remember again, the bounds by which we can have consideration of various tax rates and fees. That will take place February 21st when we convene for our recess meeting. We'll convene at 3 p.m. for some board business, and then beginning at 6:30, no earlier than 6:30, we will have consideration of items removed today from consent, and then our regular hearing items will be a number of actions associated with the budget and tax rates. Any other business to come before the board today, Ms. Jacobs?
No, there's not.
All right, we are in recess until Tuesday. Thank you.